Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we're going to talk all about tomatoes. Now, when it comes to choosing tomato plants, there are two main categories that your tomato plants can fall into, and those are determinate tomato plants or indeterminate tomato plants. So we're going to talk today about the differences between each of those. We're going to talk about basically what it means. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of each, why you may possibly choose one over the other. And finally, we're going to talk about how to care for each of them. Because while the basics are going to be the same, no matter what type of tomato plant you have, there are a few differences of how you will care for them based on whether you're growing a determinate tomato variety or an indeterminate variety. So recently, I have planted my tomato seedlings out in the garden. You can see I have them growing in a variety of different situations. And overall, at least at this point, they look all basically the same. There are a few key differences between indeterminate and determinate tomato varieties, though. I do have some of each growing in my garden. I have primarily indeterminate tomatoes, but I do have a handful of determinate tomatoes as well. So what you'll find, the main differences between the two types of tomatoes, indeterminates over the course of the season will get significantly larger than determinate tomato varieties. Determinate tomatoes are basically bred to grow to a certain size, a predetermined size. That's where the word determinate comes from. Once they reach that size, they're going to flower, they're going to set fruit, and then they're going to ripen all of their fruit pretty much at the same time, maybe within the course of a couple weeks or so. But for the most part, all of their fruit is going to be available to harvest in a pretty short window of time. And then once you harvest that fruit, the tomato plant is pretty much done. It may put on another fruit or two, but for the most part, that tomato plant will be done. An indeterminate tomato is a little bit different. That does not have a predetermined size. As long as it's healthy and stays free of disease, as long as it has the nutrients that it needs, as long as it has water and sunshine and everything that it needs to grow, that tomato plant is just going to keep growing, and they can get very large by the end of the season. They also set their fruit differently than a determinate tomato plant. An indeterminate tomato plant will flower here and there, it'll set fruit here and there, and it'll ripen its fruit gradually over the course of a very long season. Now, if it has an environment where it has all that it needs, where it stays disease-free, has adequate light and nutrients and all of that, adequate water, it's possible for it to provide tomatoes for you all the way up until the plant is killed by frost. So determinate tomatoes give you less fruit at a time, but they give you a longer growing season. So given that, there are pros and cons to each of those tomato varieties, and which one you choose, or whether you choose both, which one you choose in each situation might vary based on your goals of growing tomatoes. This is my sauce tomato patch, and in this tomato bed I have a variety of both determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. This plant is a Roma tomato, and this is a determinate tomato. While over here, this is a San Marzano tomato, this is an indeterminate. So I'm going to treat these plants a little bit differently throughout the growing season. Now, all of these plants will be supported. I just haven't gotten to that yet because these did just get in the ground. So pretty soon I will be coming out and supporting them, and we will talk about that in a minute. So this Roma tomato here, since this is a determinate tomato, this is going to ripen pretty much all of its fruit around the same time, which can be an ideal situation if you are growing a sauce tomato and you're looking to do some preserving. If you want to make tomato sauce or a big batch of salsa or something like that to can or to freeze, having all your tomatoes come in at the same time can be really helpful for that, as opposed to an indeterminate tomato, where you're kind of getting tomatoes here and there, but you may not get as much, you may not get enough all at once to do a full batch of preserving. So I am growing the San Marzano tomato, which, as I mentioned, is an indeterminate tomato, even though it's a sauce tomato. So we're going to kind of see how the season goes on. I do like to make small batches of salsa pretty regularly throughout the season that I don't preserve or anything, I just keep in my fridge. So the San Marzano will be probably primarily used for that, but we will see. Now, right now, these tomatoes are pretty similar in size because they're pretty young. They've just been put into the ground. But as they grow, there will be eventually a noticeable size difference, with the indeterminate tomatoes becoming quite a bit taller than the determinates. So if you are looking to grow a tomato in a small space, maybe in a pot on your deck or something like that, a determinate tomato can be a good choice for that, just because it's a little bit smaller, it's an easier type of plant to support, takes up less space overall. So if you're really limited on space, that's another reason why a determinate tomato could be a good option for you. That being said, I do grow both determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, actually mostly indeterminate tomatoes, in pots on my deck. So that doesn't mean that you can't grow an indeterminate tomato in a pot. Just if space is a real important consideration for you, that could be another reason why you may want to consider growing a determinate tomato. Also, kind of going along with the smaller size of a determinate tomato, they can be a little bit easier to support. So over here, you can see that I have this wall that will ultimately be supporting these tomato plants. This can be a great option for indeterminate tomatoes, which get a little bit larger. So just like there are some advantages to growing determinate tomatoes, there are lots of advantages to growing indeterminate tomatoes as well. While you don't get as much fruit in a short amount of time, I find that the extended harvest that you get generally leads to an overall larger yield from an indeterminate tomato. So if you're looking for tomatoes for fresh eating throughout the season, to snack on, or just to make dishes with, for fresh eating, not a giant preserving batch, an indeterminate tomato can be a great option for that because they're not going to inundate you with an overwhelming amount of fruit all at once. Instead, you will get fruits here and there over the course of a much longer season than a determinate tomato. So I find that to be a big advantage. Another big advantage of the indeterminate tomatoes is that there are a lot more varieties available. Because the main advantage of determinate tomatoes comes when you're either trying to save space or you're trying to preserve a large amount of tomato products, most of the determinate varieties you'll find are either sauce tomatoes or they're just smaller patio tomatoes, something like that. Where indeterminate tomatoes come in a huge array of varieties. They come in all sizes, shapes, colors. Most cherry tomatoes that you'll find, of course there are exceptions to everything, but most cherry tomatoes that you'll find, in my experience, are indeterminate tomatoes. And a lot of those really good, beautiful heirloom slicer tomatoes are also indeterminate tomatoes. So most of my favorite varieties are indeterminates, and I primarily grow indeterminate tomatoes, with the exception of some of my sauce tomatoes, as I mentioned before. So we're going to talk about some of the differences between caring for indeterminate versus determinate tomatoes. So the first thing we want to talk about is tomato suckers. Now, if you see here, this is the main stem of the tomato, this is the leaf, and in between, at about a 45-degree angle, you can see these little stems that are coming out in like the little armpits of the tomato. This is what's known as a tomato sucker. So you'll find many different opinions and strategies for pruning indeterminate tomatoes. As I said, people all have a different idea of what works best, and some of that may be related to your growing style, some of it may be related to your climate, so there isn't really one right answer when it comes to pruning indeterminate tomatoes. But most people do agree that your tomatoes will stay healthier and more manageable if you do prune them to some extent. Most people do choose to remove the suckers, what I just showed you from that tomato back there, from their indeterminate tomato varieties. Because as I said, the indeterminate tomato will just keep growing and growing. That main stem throughout the season will just continue getting taller and taller and producing more fruit. What will happen if you let those suckers stay on the plant? Each of those suckers will turn into another main stem, and that can quickly turn into a really unmanageable, unruly plant. So when it comes to indeterminate tomatoes, most people choose to remove at least the majority of the suckers. I usually let one or so grow on my plant to get a couple main stems, but I do remove the majority of them. Now, when it comes to determinate tomatoes, it is very different. Determinate tomatoes, in addition to having a determined size that they're going to reach, they also have a determined amount of fruit that they're going to set, or that they will set under ideal conditions. If you remove those suckers, each of those suckers will ultimately become a fruit-bearing stem. If you remove the suckers from the determinate tomato plant, you are going to be robbing yourself of a lot of the harvest that you could receive, because that plant is not going to get bigger. In the case of an indeterminate tomato, you remove the suckers, the main stem just grows taller and produces more flowers and more fruit. A determinate tomato will not do that, so if you remove those suckers, you're removing some of its fruiting potential. So when it comes to a determinate tomato plant, you do want to leave the suckers in place. Now that's going to lead to a bushier plant, but because they don't get as tall, I find that it's still pretty manageable to leave the suckers in place when it comes to determinate tomatoes. So we touched a little bit on tomato support and some of the differences between supporting determinate versus indeterminate tomatoes, but let's talk about that in a little more detail. So tomato cages, like the ones behind me, make a great support option, primarily for determinate tomatoes. Now, having said that, if you have been following along with me for a while, you know that I break a lot of the rules, and I break a lot of my own rules pretty often too. So I will say that these plants behind me are actually indeterminate tomatoes. These are cherry tomatoes, which is why I'm supporting them with cages. But you'll find what I'm telling you today are the guidelines. I do not always follow them. So take from that what you will. What I take from it is that, these plants want to grow, they want to be healthy, so it's pretty hard to completely mess them up. Anyway, back to my point about these cages. Something like this can be a great option for supporting determinate tomato plants because they don't require as much support, as opposed to my tomato wall. So as you can see, this wall here is significantly taller than the tomato cages. This is going to allow these plants to continue growing up this wall. So as these tomato plants grow throughout the season, I will continually clip them onto this wall so that they stay supported as they grow. So let me know in the comments what you prefer to grow. Do you like to grow determinate tomatoes, indeterminate tomatoes, or like me, do you like to grow a mix of both? Also, if you have any tips for supporting indeterminate versus determinate tomatoes or how you prune either of those, I would love to hear from you in the comments because, as I said, I'm giving the rough guidelines, but this is not a one-size-fits-all method. So you can do something completely differently than I do, and we can both be doing it the right way because it's the way that works best for us in our growing conditions. So thank you for joining me today, for hanging out with me in the tomato patch. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.